Hi, and thank you for joining us. This presentation is going to focus on how to develop, or the considerations rather, that you need to take into account to develop a medical device cybersecurity program. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is John Gomez, and I'm the founder of Sensato. Sensato is a cybersecurity solutions firm specifically focused in healthcare. And what I hope to do today is talk through some of the things that you really need to consider. I'm going to focus on those practical items that most people don't think about when you're thinking about a medical device cybersecurity program, or at least in our experience, they haven't thought about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we do in this space. So just wanted to give you a heads up that that will be coming. But I'd say about 80% of this presentation is really meant to help educate you in a non-marketing, non-sales manner on those things that you really need to take into consideration when you're designing and developing your own medical device cybersecurity program. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about kind of the background with Sensato and medical device security. I think this is important because it helps to establish a little bit of credibility as to why you might want to listen to what we have to say when it comes to developing your own program. We actually got started as a company in 2013, specifically focused, in fact, we were the first healthcare specific cybersecurity firm. But we, in 2015, started to get asked to help organizations develop medical device security programs and conduct risk assessments for them. We soon found that there was not a lot of leadership in this space, so in 2016 we founded a medical device cybersecurity task force. The task force was composed of medical device manufacturers and hospitals coming together to really think about what needs to occur when you develop, or what should you be thinking about, what should you do if you're attempting to deploy a medical device security program. We then in 2017 established the Sensato ISAO. If you're not familiar with what an ISAO is, you can go to isao.org and you'll get more information you probably ever wanted to know. But an ISAO ultimately is chartered under executive order by the President of the United States to be an information sharing and analysis organization for cybersecurity. We specifically focus on critical infrastructure as an ISAO. So we take everything that we learn from medical device security and kind of share that. We also, in 2018, were named the Medical Device Cybersecurity Company to Watch by Cyber Ventures. And we were also in the same year asked by the FDA to sign a trilateral agreement, a memorandum of understanding between ourselves and HISAC. Now, specifically, that MOU really focuses on are providing support to FDA and HISAC in the event of a medical device security incident that impacts the United States. I can certainly get more into that, but I want to kind of move forward and not get too bogged down with this. But I wanted to at least establish a foundation. Speaking of foundations, I think it's also important to know that we have a variety of partnerships. We are the exclusive partner for the Greater New York, North Carolina, New Jersey, Washington State Hospital Associations. We've already talked about our work with DHS as an ISAO, our MOU with FDA, and based in New Jersey, we work often with the New Jersey Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Cell, or NJCCIC, and we also are a cybersecurity partner by Premier. So we've gone through a variety of due diligences, pretty deep due diligences, to kind of establish these partnerships. These weren't things that just kind of happened. They were competitive diligences in which we were selected as the exclusive partner. So hopefully with that foundation, the rest of this presentation, as I said, is meant to be very educational and to almost give you somewhat of a checklist of things that you need to consider. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out. I'll provide you with contact information at the end of the presentation, but I'm happy to share other thoughts with you and discuss what you may be thinking, and however possible to help, be happy to help and share information. So let's talk a little bit about the current state of medical device cybersecurity. Now, most of you probably know all this, so I'm going to try and highlight a few different things, but these are things that you probably want to share with executives and boards to help orient them to why this is an important thing for you to be doing. One of the, I think, first things is that, we all kind of know that FDA has warned on multiple occasions that there is a danger when it comes to medical devices connected to a network. And I think it's important that we segment that danger into two kind of aspects. One is those attacks on devices that ultimately impact and affect patient care, which is obviously the most critical of the two types of things that could happen. And the second one is where medical devices become a pivot point for getting to other systems in the hospital. So you have to think about both of those things when you think about these warnings from FDA, which are obviously very credible, is how are you protecting human life, right, which is one, and two, how are you protecting the rest of the infrastructure in the organization if that device becomes exploited. Another thing that I think is really interesting that's come up and many people may not know about, which I think is a very senior level discussion that has to happen inside a hospital, is this blog posting by FDA. Now, in this blog, you can read this online. They really brought up the question about, if a medical device can potentially be attacked, if it has vulnerabilities, if there are cybersecurity risks related to that attack, to that device, should a patient be informed? Now, if you think about informed consent to a procedure or a test, patients have the right to know the risks involved with that procedure or test, right? So I think that, this is a really important piece to consider, which is if there are risks associated with their care due to a potential impact on a medical device, should that be part of informed consent? Now, at this point, I'm not aware of any, regulation that requires that disclosure, but I do think, and I would believe that from a civil liability perspective, there could probably make a really good case by a set of attorneys that if you as a hospital had no medical device security program, that would be a risk. Or if you had one and you detected vulnerabilities associated with devices and you didn't inform patients in either of those cases, that you would probably need to defend yourself. So I'm bringing this up because I think this is a really great way to deal with something and get ahead of it, and secondly, as a way to surface the need for these types of programs in your organization. So just something to be aware of, but it's a really kind of non-technical discussion, which obviously the outcome of this would require some technical approach. Sometimes I get told, well, there's never really been any attacks on medical devices, so why should we care? And I think it's important to understand that we need to really unpack what that statement means. Has there been an actual attack against a medical device in which a patient or a patient was impacted? So I think that, it's a yes and no answer. Ransomware attacks have taken out medical devices. We've seen things that happened with Petya and WannaCry and not Petya. But we've also seen specific attacks like Orange Worm, which did target medical devices. Now, in this case, thankfully, the attack was targeting medical devices as a pivot point, right? I talked about those two types of attack, one that impacts patient care directly, and those where the medical device is used to get to other things in the organization, or pivoting. And that's what Orange Worm was, it pivoted. Urgent 11, Ripple 20, and Swentooth are all types of vulnerabilities which have come to be known because people are researching how to attack medical devices. Now, I bring that up because if you're of the mindset like, well, it's never happened, you may not be really stacking the odds in your favor. The fact that there are actively cybersecurity researchers that are looking at how to break into medical devices means that is the known. The problem is that is the tip of the iceberg, and we don't really know the unknown. It's also really important to make it very clear that these types of research activities are not conducted by FDA or DHS or others in terms of going out and proactively trying to figure out how to break into medical devices. And that's not a slight on any of those groups. I just want to clear the table in terms of, hey, don't assume that this is being done. This is only being done by cybersecurity researchers independently. And again, I can tell you with a lot of confidence that if they are doing it and they are reporting their findings, then there are probably a larger number of nation-state, terrorist, or criminal organizations who are doing very similar things without reporting their findings. So you are definitely, probably don't have the odds stacked in your favor when it comes to, assuming that the past is an indicator of the future. We also know that we've had this situation in Germany that happened rather recently from the date that this video was recorded, and that is that a patient unfortunately did die due to an attack against a hospital in Germany. Now, this was not a directed attack against medical devices, but it has been a wake-up call as to the potential loss of life from a cybersecurity attack. So if we use that as kind of a precedent, you will, I think you're going to see that there is going to be a much, much more stringent expectation of how you're securing the environment which protects patient lives. And in this case, unfortunately, this was due to the ransomware attack taking out all systems in the hospital. And so the patient had to be transferred, and due to that transfer, complications arose in transit, and they unfortunately lost their life. So I think what you're seeing is there is certainly an evolution here as to things not only becoming more serious in terms of the expectation of security for medical devices, but also we are starting to see early indicators that attackers are becoming much more serious vis-a-vis researchers, quote unquote, in terms of figuring out how to exploit these devices. So in many ways, yes, there is a clock kind of ticking, and the question really ultimately becomes who gets to be first, right? Who will be the first healthcare organization that has to disclose that a patient was impacted due to a direct attack on a medical device? So hopefully all of that helps you set the stage if you need to have conversations with your leadership or even to do your own research and determine what is right for you or wrong. I realize that resources are highly limited in most organizations and that you have enough on your plate as it is, more than likely. So you really certainly can figure out how to either justify you don't need to be doing this or that you probably need to, and make that a priority over the coming months. So with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what resources you can kind of embrace and where to start. So there is a document that was published back in 2018. We actually had some input into that, arm's length input, I would say. We were doing tabletop simulations for organization, and some of the learnings that came out of those tabletop simulations were used to help create some of the information you read in this document. And this document is the Medical Device Cybersecurity Regional Incident Preparedness and Response Playbook, which is obviously a mouthful, but you can download this off the FDA website and go through it. But there are basically 5 sections in the document. You have to demonstrate that you have prepared for medical device attacks. You have to demonstrate that you can detect and analyze those type of attacks, that you can contain those attacks and then hopefully remove them from the environment, and that you have the ability to recover from those, both operationally and technically, physically. And then you are part of a threat intelligence regional response program that if you get attacked, you are participating in sharing that information. And this is somewhat challenging for some hospitals because legal counsel and others don't want to disclose that this has happened. But it is an important piece which best practices state if you are impacted, if a patient is impacted, you need to really communicate that so that other patients' lives are not impacted across the United States or possibly the world, and that action can be taken by the proper authorities to limit the spread of this type of attack. So that is basically a good starting point. But I'm going to boil all this down for you into some kind of simple steps. Ultimately, what you're trying to do, whether it's medical device security, IoT security, IT security, or whatever else you may be thinking of, when it comes to cybersecurity, there are 3 things you're trying to do. And the more integrated these processes, the more that you have one approach to all 3 of these things, the better you're going to be, the more mature your program will be. All too often, we see that not just in medical device security, but all cybersecurity, these things are highly separated and siloed. And that's a problem because it will impact everything you do. But when we're talking about patient lives, this is really not a good practice to silo. You want these things fully integrated. First thing is compliance. You want to make sure that you're able to comply with best practices and obviously regulations. The second thing is you want to be able to detect attacks and be able to identify that there's an attack, or not just detect an attack, but detect a potential vulnerability or weakness in your system. And the last thing is you want to be able to respond. We'll talk about response as a separate topic. Actually, we'll talk about each one of these as we go through things. But response is, if there is ever an attack, how do you respond? And then ultimately, you want these things to feed into each other, right? As you are deploying best practices, those should improve how you do detection. If you detect something, it should be able to flow into how you respond, and then the lessons learned from response should flow into compliance. So these three things working together, highly, highly important that you achieve this, even if it's over time. But this should be your end goal, that you have an integrated, or what I call a holistic, medical device cybersecurity program. So there are a lot of things to consider, and often when I work with people or interact with them or talk to them about medical device security, most of these things are not considered. But you really need to think about how does medical device security integrate with IT security, right? This is a really important thing. We want to get to that kind of common operating picture. So how do you create that common operating picture so that your organization has a full picture of what's happening, right? Is something occurring with a set of servers that leads to a medical device compromise? Is a medical device compromise which leads to impact to the rest of the hospital? Those things need to be a single picture. The more you silo those things, the harder time you're going to have with compliance and response. So you also need to understand that there is special expertise here, at least in the initial stages of rolling this program out, but you're going to have a lot of questions related to how do you respond to these types of events? How do you prioritize them? How does the triage process work? What are the proper policies and practices, right? All of these things are going to be important, and it requires special expertise. And then what happens if there is an incident? How will you respond to that? We'll talk more about it, but incident response when it comes to medical devices is vastly, night and day different than responding to anything else that you may have in your environment. And then what happens after something is deployed, right? How is it going to evolve? Who's going to maintain it? How do you continue to govern that program? And how do you evolve the program? And then who monitors and maintains all this? Who is going to deal with threat intelligence and best practices and all of the things that go into a program of this nature? Now, some of you may have the resources for this, some of you may not. But whether you do or you don't, these things do need to be addressed. And is this really, whatever you're looking at, is it truly a complete solution, or is it just a single piece of the puzzle? When we look at software, all too often, we find that in most cases, the software provided by pretty much every vendor out there is simply one piece of the puzzle. You're ultimately left to figure out all the other things on this page by yourself. And so it may be great that you've deployed software, but software is not a complete, holistic cybersecurity solution for medical devices that is considered mature or even meets all of the recommendations of the FDA MITRE Incident Response Playbook for medical device security. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, especially if you think about the fact that if you buy software and you are attacked and a patient is impacted, you may have a very rude awakening in a deposition, in a situation where attorneys are asking you, what about all these other things? One way to think about this is what happens if those attorneys were to bring me on as an expert witness and ask me, what should these people have done? Again, I'm trying to illustrate that as an organization, as an industry, we're very immature in these practices and approaches. So I guess the bottom line is software alone is not a holistic and effective solution. And please keep that in mind. You can't do everything overnight, but if you're going to do this on your own, you should have a long-term vision of how you're going to get to a fully holistic system that includes compliance detection and response and is integrated. So ultimately, as I said, you're kind of trying to balance these three things: the ability to comply, the ability to respond, and the ability to detect. We've kind of talked through these things, so it's important to, at least understand that these are the key components, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper into each one of these items. So let's talk about comply. We mentioned that ultimately this is about employing critical best practices. So here's some of the things you need to think about. First of all, is you should have policies and practices that are specific to cybersecurity, not just retread your IT cybersecurity practices and policies. You need to have them specific to medical devices. I'll repeat that again. Specific policies and practices for medical device cybersecurity. Again, if you ever get called into a deposition or having to defend yourself civilly or possibly criminally, you need to be able to demonstrate and say, here's our cybersecurity policies and practices, and we took time to really think about how we're going to effectively defend medical devices. Remember, this brings into account things like informed consent and things of that nature, which are not typically part of IT security policies or privacy practices. You need to have a vendor assessment framework. And again, you may have this where you're actually, as part of your purchasing cycle, you're vetting vendors or medical device manufacturers regarding their medical device security, how they're developing the devices, what security implications there are, what risks there are, the MDS2. This should be part of a documented framework. Again, you don't want to just recycle what you already have and apply that. But if you do, make sure you evolve it to include specific considerations related to medical device security. For example, is there a 24/7 security operations contact point that if something happens with a device, you have the ability to get a hold of somebody? Most vendors don't have that. It doesn't mean they need to do it or they shouldn't do it, but you need to know that so you can say you were aware of that risk and you accepted it. You have to have an end-of-life program. You cannot probably afford to get rid of every end-of-life medical device you have in your environment, but you should be able to demonstrate that you have a program, that you've assessed which devices are end-of-life, and then how you're going to get rid of them over time. Are you going to replace them or upgrade them over time? And again, you have to be able to justify that you have the proper economic rationale for that. You can't just say we didn't want to invest. Obviously, if your organization has money to invest in other things, you really want to be able to demonstrate that those other things were not as higher priority rather than a medical device replacement. So keep that in mind. You need to think about who is the medical device cybersecurity team. Now, this is important because medical devices, as you'll learn when we get into response, have to have clinicians involved. You need to be able to have clinicians help manage and identify and prioritize risk, as well as your practices and policies related to these devices. Again, this may be somewhat different than you do under IT security, but it is extremely important. So please, make sure that your medical device cybersecurity team, it can be a subset of your IT security team, but that it's expanded to include clinical engineering, your clinical teams, and others that need to be part of this. A threat intelligence program. How are you dealing and gaining medical device threat intelligence, right? You may have threat intelligence coming in for your servers or for other things, but how are you able to describe how you're doing threat intelligence specific to medical devices? And some of this is not always the recall notices. Some of this is other avenues and channels that you should be monitoring to understand if there is a threat related to medical device security. And then how are you governing the program? Right, this is a big one. How are you evolving it? How are you assuring it's not becoming stagnated, that it is that you're deploying and examining latest best practices? So how often is the medical device security team meeting? And is that enough of a pace to really demonstrate that you're up on top of things, right? So these are some of the critical best practices. They're not all of them, but I want to get you kind of thinking about, okay, what do you need to do in order to create this compliance capability? The second thing is detection. How are you detecting attacks? And we'll come back to why some of these things are here in a moment, but deep packet inspection is really important. Now, for many of you, you may be doing log-based security, and so you really need to have something in place that is monitoring network traffic. This is really, really important because in many cases, you cannot deploy something to a medical device and you cannot get the logs from a medical device. So watching the traffic, critical. Deception technologies. Your strategy should include honeypots, especially level 1 honeypots. I'm not going to get into the different levels of honeypots. There's level 1, 2, and 3, but you should at least have a level 1. And I would tell you, you probably don't want level 2 and 3. Again, if you want to know why, feel free to reach out, but you should have honeypots deployed. And again, we'll come back to why that's important. You need to have host intrusion detection, the ability to deploy some form of agent to the monitoring stations that are often considered to be part of the medical device environment or ecosystem. So this is really important that you're able to do something that you can deploy to monitor those specific machines. So a lot of times they're going to be Windows machines, they're going to be end of life, and you need to be able to monitor those. These are not the medical devices, but rather the monitoring systems that speak to the medical devices. All too often, you can't have antivirus on those machines because they could interrupt operations. Host intrusion detection systems typically do not interrupt operations, and they're a safer bet for you. You obviously want to have asset fingerprinting and management, the ability to identify devices that you may not know are on the network. We all have that story of the cardiologist who invited in a vendor, deployed something, and nobody knew it was out there. Again, really important that you can manage and monitor the network and then do asset fingerprinting off of network traffic. And then you want a vulnerability assessment program. How are you going after and scanning assets? medical devices. What is that program? How is that coordination done? You can't just blindly press a button and scan 100 smart pumps. You have to coordinate that. So part of your comply should be a set of practices on how devices will be scanned, and then you should have the ability to scan those devices. And then you want 25/7 monitoring. You want a common operating picture. You need some way. This is not monitoring servers. When you put a medical device cybersecurity program in place, you can't do the, well, Steve is on call or Janet's on call. Something comes up, somebody will call them. You have minutes to respond because you may have a patient connected to this device. So if you're going to wait to wake somebody up at home, chances are whatever impact that attack has had or will have is done. So this is a big, big eye-opener and actually brings us into, the ability to respond. So when we think about response, obviously it's got to be 24/7, but we now have a patient connected. And one of the things I do when I'm teaching on this subject is I try to get people to understand that what we've done for incident response for IT systems is wrong. It's a really bad approach how we respond to incident response, cybersecurity incident response with IT systems. So if we take those practices and then try to do them on medical devices, it's doubly wrong, right? So you need to really understand how this works. Incident response for medical devices is much more like clinical rapid response. In fact, what I would counsel you to do is use your clinical rapid response team as your frontline cybersecurity response team for medical devices. Because if a patient is impacted, that team can intervene. They have the medical skills. They have a good cross-section of people involved. They're typically available 24/7 in most hospitals. And they're able to prioritize risk and impact immediately. What they don't have is the cybersecurity training. So you need to figure out how you're going to train them and how you're going to run simulations. So this really is kind of, what I just said to you is pretty much everything that's on the screen, but it is a very specialized area and something that you need to think about how you do and how you do it right. And it is, again, why the medical device cybersecurity team cannot just be the IT team, right? You don't need somebody calling the help desk and then the help desk trying to decide if this medical device should be shut down or calling somebody at home. This also goes back to why, in most cases, you will need some form of 24/7 security operations center, even if it's a little baby one and not a full-blown security operations center. Obviously, economics play into this, but you need to be able to have something or some level of program that fits your environment and your ability to scale down or up. So, some things to know. As I know a lot, I just gave you, you're like, okay, that's a lot to know in and of itself, but I just want to point out a few kind of things that could trip you up. Many of you may have third-party medical device networks, meaning you have a network that's deployed by the manufacturer. And without getting into the names of manufacturer, there's a few leading manufacturers who deploy their medical devices with their own network, and they manage that network. It's not under IT control. So in this situation, you need to really talk about how you're going to respond to incidents related to that. How will you be notified about them? If somebody were to break into that network and compromise patient care, how are you told? This is a big, big conversation, and most medical device manufacturers that do this do not have a good answer. I would specifically suggest that you do have those conversations, but this is also an opportunity for deployment of honeypots. Now, they're not going to detect every attack on a medical device network, but they are safe to deploy because they're fully passive, assuming that you've deployed a passive honeypot, level 1. And secondly, they give you an alert if somebody's on the network doing something they shouldn't do. So I think this is really important for you to do and think about, but it is something that you need to think about, because if you start deploying software and monitoring solutions on a medical device network and the vendor of that medical device network has not cleared you, you could very easily be violating 510K requirements. You could be very easily violating warranties, and you may have that medical device vendor come back and say, because you introduced that security system into their network, you actually cause patient safety issues. So you got to be really careful. This is a very, very tightrope kind of situation, and one that most people don't know about. So we've talked about incident response challenges and returns. I don't want to kind of belabor it. So point is, this is not IT security incident response. This is medical device incident response, and it is a very specialized approach and field. And you need to think about how this is going to be done. Most importantly, how you're going to educate and test your resources. There's very little resources out there for you to kind of say, okay, let's take this training. There's even talk, we've had talk with people about creating a specialty called a cybersecurity nurse. So something to think about. Obviously, there are resource challenges you need to consider. There are a variety of projects, there's expertise and bandwidth. This is something I probably don't need to go into with you, but just, respecting the fact that, as many different types of organizations and cultures there are many different types of models that work effectively for your institution, and how to customize that and make it right for you is really, really important. So I want to kind of switch tracks. Everything I just gave you was the 80% of this presentation, which is these are all the things you need to think about. This is what you need to do. Really, everything comes down to comply, detect, respond, which maps back to that FDA MITRE playbook. And so what I want to do now is shift tracks to tell you how we support that, what we do. I hope you will honor me with the ability to just listen for a few minutes to what we do. And if it works for you and you think this would be appropriate for you, then please reach out to us. But I want to spend a little time talking about how we take everything I just told you that you could do on your own if you really want to, and make it vastly, vastly easier by kind of packaging all that up into one single solution, which we call MDCOP. Now, MDCOP stands for Medical Device Common Operating Picture, just to let you know. So we basically took this playbook, which I said we had kind of an arm's length input into, and we decided, how do we support all of these things? And so that is what MDCOP does. MDCOP ultimately attempts to support all of the things in this playbook. And it does that by not just providing software, but providing the other components that are critical for you to be successful in establishing and deploying a holistic medical device security program. Now, all of this comes down to comply, detect, respond. So I can break it down in both ways, but what I want to do is kind of break it out by the way that the FDA laid this out in their playbook. So you have prepare, detect, contain, recover, and response. We support all of that. We actually, in the MDCOP program, provide you with all of the things that you need through three different components: policies and guidance, our CTOC, and Nightingale. I'll explain what these are right now. Sensato Nightingale is our software platform, right? It is a fully integrated platform that supports comply, detect, respond. It has the ability to support deep packet inspection on networks, so we can see traffic going across. We have native HL7 and DICOM analyzers built in. We have the ability to do asset fingerprinting. We have the ability to detect attacks against medical devices. We have the ability to do asset management. We have the ability to do asset valuation. So all of the things that you would expect, and probably a lot more, is built into Nightingale. And actually, a lot more, because we also have honeypots that are fully integrated that you can deploy, and we have host intrusion detection systems that can be deployed as agents on systems which are non-volatile. We also have the ability to do agentless deployment. So those situations where you can't deploy any software to a medical device or monitoring system, we can still support agentless. And we have vulnerability assessment capabilities. So all of that is built into Nightingale. So the foundation of this is basically an amazingly powerful, fully integrated single platform that can be deployed in literally hours once you complete the training program. Second thing we have is what we call the Sensato CTOC, or Cybersecurity Tactical Operations Center. Now, the CTOC is a healthcare-specific security operations center. We are not just monitoring, a car parts store one minute, and then a flower and garden center the next, and a home warehouse system the next. The CTOC is specifically monitoring hospital systems. We understand the terminology. We know what a RIS-PACS is. We know what smart pumps are. We know what MRI is, we know what a lab system is, we know what an EMR is, we know all these things. And it helps us really understand not only your challenges, but how to help you develop practices to respond to incidents related to medical devices, as well as other infrastructure in the hospital. This is a 24/7 system. It is, basically human eyes on glass. We customize it to meet your requirements and needs, so that regardless of your size or scale, they can either be your full security operations center, a complement to an existing security operations center, or something in between. But this gives you a 24/7 human staff security operations component. The last piece is the actual specific MDCOP program, which layers on top of it. And that is, we have policy templates, we've got vendor assessment framework templates, We have incident response training programs that we provide. All of that, everything that I mentioned, literally everything that we told you in the prior part of this presentation that you need to think about and implement, we've taken and built into a single solution. And I think that's really kind of the important takeaway from what we do versus some of the other solutions that are out there. We are full stack. We're not just going to give you the software and then tell you you can go figure out everything else. We actually give you Word documents that are templates you can use with your organization, and we help you. We'll be part of the meetings and talk to you about why you don't want to change something or why you should. We actually have that relationship with FDA and MOU with them. We have inroads into Department of Homeland Security. We understand what's happening in the environment. We can deploy the entire Nightingale platform within hours, as I said, after you complete training. And training doesn't take very long. It's pretty much about 16 hours broken up into a series of modules to fit your schedule. So it's also, as I mentioned, not just Sensato. As I was kind of just talking about, we have partnerships that we can leverage and build upon that you don't have to go really worry about putting in place, and that we support and continue to evolve and work with. And it's not just you, right? The big difference here is you're not going to have to worry about deploying the software and the policies and the practices and doing the training and getting your clinicians involved. As I mentioned, we have a lot of that worked out. We have it all figured out and worked out. We just have to customize it to make it right for you, and we do that. We customize for you. We're not expecting you to fit us. But most importantly is we're really truly trying to be a partner. So we do listen to what you have to say. What are your concerns? What are your priorities? What are your limitations? And how do we help you get to where you want to go? We truly do believe MD COP is unlike anything else out there. And that might be sound a little arrogant. I truly don't mean it to be, but we don't know of any other solution that is not just software, but actually includes a fully integrated SOC, a fully integrated set of policies, practices, and training and response programs, backed by threat intelligence, backed by partnerships and relationships that we don't believe anyone else has. And more importantly, it's all us, right? We're not outsourcing things to third parties. We've had competitors of ours come to us and ask if they could license our SOC. And when we say no, they will go and license somebody else's. We've kind of built all of this from the ground up to assure it is a fully integrated, holistic solution. So with that, I'm hoping that you find this intriguing, that you'll reach out to us. You can reach out to us at info@sensato.co. Our phone number's out there. And you can also reach to us online through our website at sensato.co. So hopefully this was, regardless of if you decide to go on your own or you think that maybe you'd be intrigued enough to ask more about what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Again, if you decide to go on your own, happy to help however we can, share what we can. But again, I really truly thank you for the time you've taken today.